Their son vanished without a trace, leaving only emptiness and unanswered questions. 2 decades of birthdays, holidays and milestones passed in the shadow of his absence. Then, on an ordinary Sunday morning, his familiar face stared back at them from a church bulletin, shattering everything they thought they knew. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. It was a golden Saturday in Boise, Idaho, when Mary Johnson held tightly to her 5-year-old son, Lucas's hand. The summer fair had been circled on their calendar for weeks, a family tradition that Mary and her husband Robert maintained religiously each year. The Johnson family weaved through the bustling fairgrounds, their movements synchronized despite the chaos of the crowd around them. "Look, Mommy, the horses!" Lucas pointed excitedly toward the vintage carousel at the center of the fairgrounds. His heterochromatic eyes, one blue, one honey brown, wide with wonder. Those unique eyes had been a topic of conversation since his birth, making him instantly recognizable in any crowd. Mary smiled down at her son, adjusting the red cap that kept slipping over his forehead. "We'll go there next, sweetheart," she promised, exchanging a warm glance with Robert, who was already reaching for the camera hanging around his neck. The sweet scent of popcorn and cotton candy filled the air as families laughed and children squealed with delight. Summer in Boise meant long, languid days that stretched into warm evenings, and the Johnsons had planned to stay until closing time. Robert, usually reserved and focused on work, seemed relaxed today, his smile genuine as he watched his son's excitement. "I'll take him for a ride," Robert offered, lifting Lucas onto the painted horse with careful hands. "You rest for a bit." Mary nodded gratefully, finding a bench nearby where she could watch her 2 favorite people in the world. Robert snapped a picture just as the carousel began to move, capturing Lucas on his chosen steed, his Spider-Man sneakers a blur of red and blue, his face pure joy and innocence. It was a perfect moment, one that would later haunt the family's dreams for decades to come. After the ride, Mary took Lucas's small hand again as they headed toward the food stalls. The fairground was growing more crowded as afternoon approached, with families streaming in from all directions. Susan had wanted to join them, but a summer cold had kept Mary's sister home. Then, in a single heart-stopping moment that would divide their lives into before and after, Lucas slipped from Mary's grasp. No cry, no warning, just an empty space where her son had been. The world seemed to tilt as panic set in, the sounds of laughter and music suddenly distant, her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "Lucas!" Mary called, her voice barely audible at first, then rising to a desperate shout. "Lucas!" Robert spun around, confusion giving way to alarm as he saw the terror in his wife's eyes. The crowd continued to move around them, oblivious to the nightmare that had just begun. Hours stretched into an eternity as search teams combed every inch of the fairgrounds. The carousel music that once brought joy now haunted the air like a mocking soundtrack to their nightmare. Mary Johnson refused to leave, her body running on adrenaline and fear as she clutched Nino, the stuffed elephant that should have been in her son's arms instead of hers. "Please! He's wearing red Spider-Man sneakers and a cap," she repeated to each new volunteer, her voice growing hoarser with each passing hour. The police established a command center, pinning maps to boards and organizing grid searches of the surrounding woods. Detective Rachel Evans took personal charge, her determined eyes meeting Mary's whenever hope began to waver. Days blurred together. Mary slept in their car, if she slept at all. The fairgrounds emptied of visitors but filled with volunteers, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like fireflies. She memorized every face, scrutinized every stranger, and jumped at every call of "Mom" from children who weren't hers. Robert tried to be the pillar they both needed. He brought her clean clothes and forced her to eat, his own eyes red-rimmed and hollow. But as the first week passed with no leads, something shifted between them. His shoulders began to slump under an invisible weight. "You were holding his hand," he whispered one night, the words escaping like a confession. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Mary flinched as though struck. "And you were taking pictures instead of watching him," she countered, immediately regretting the words. The damage was done. Their conversations dwindled to logistics and updates, the silence between them growing like a living thing. When their eyes met, guilt and blame reflected back at each other, a mirror neither could bear to face. By the third week, the search scaled back. Volunteers returned to their lives, offering sympathetic smiles and promises to keep looking. The media vans that had crowded the entrance thinned out, moving on to fresher tragedies. Robert started going to work again, his routine a desperate grasp at normalcy. Mary remained, a ghost haunting the fairgrounds, retracing the same paths until security gently suggested she go home. Susan came from Spokane, coaxing her sister away with gentle hands and promises that the police would call immediately with any news. The fair, once a cherished summer tradition, became a wound that never healed, a place the Johnsons would drive miles out of their way to avoid, even years later. The carousel's cheerful melody would forever trigger panic in Mary's chest, while the scent of popcorn and cotton candy became harbingers of loss rather than joy. 20 years had passed since that fateful day at the Boise Fairgrounds, yet Mary Johnson's determination never wavered. Her modest suburban home had transformed into a shrine of remembrance, a testament to her unwavering belief that Lucas would someday return. The living room walls, once adorned with family photographs, now displayed a meticulous collage of newspaper clippings, yellowed missing person posters, and large maps dotted with countless red pins marking potential sightings. He's out there somewhere," Mary would whisper to herself each morning, touching the last photo taken of Lucas before he vanished, the carousel image capturing his innocent smile beneath that red cap. Her fingers had traced the outline of his face so often that the photograph's edges had begun to wear thin. Every July 15th, Mary would make the solemn pilgrimage to the fairgrounds. The carousel still stood, though its paint had faded and the music sounded more melancholy to her ears. She would sit on a nearby bench until dusk, light a single candle, and speak to Lucas as if he could hear her. "I'm still waiting, sweetheart. I'll never stop looking." Robert couldn't bear the weight of this ritual. In the early years, he had stood beside her, holding her hand as they both wept. But as time stretched on, the grief carved different paths through their lives. His letters became sporadic, then stopped altogether. Phone calls dwindled to awkward silences, punctuated by sighs. 3 years ago, he had packed his belongings and moved to the other side of Idaho, unable to live in the shadow of their shared loss any longer. "He's given up," Mary told Susan during one of her sister's weekly visits. "But I can't. I won't." Susan placed a casserole dish on the kitchen counter and embraced her sister. The peacemaker of the family had become Mary's lifeline, the only person who didn't suggest therapy or moving on. Instead, she brought home-cooked meals, cleaned the house when Mary's obsession consumed her energy, and gently reminded her to rest. "Have you eaten today?" Susan asked, noticing the untouched breakfast on the table. Mary nodded absently, her attention already drifting back to the newspaper article she'd been reading about a teenager found states away who'd been missing for years. "Mary," Susan said softly, "you need to take care of yourself. Lucas would want that." At the mention of his name, Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Sometimes I think I see him in the grocery store, at the park, just glimpses. Am I losing my mind, Susan?" Her sister squeezed her hand. "No. You're just a mother who loves her son." That night, after Susan left, Mary stood before the wall of memories, tracing the timeline she'd created. "I'll find you," she promised the smiling boy in the photographs, "no matter how long it takes." The spring morning in Spokane arrived with gentle sunlight streaming through Susan's kitchen window. Mary Johnson had been there for 3 days now, helping her sister recover from gallbladder surgery. Though she moved efficiently around the unfamiliar kitchen, preparing tea and organizing medication, Mary's thoughts remained anchored to her home in Boise, to the wall of missing posters and the bedroom frozen in time. "You're miles away again," Susan observed from her recliner, voice still raspy from the hospital. "Why don't you take a break? The pharmacy called. My prescription's ready." Mary nodded, grateful for the distraction. The sisters had always been close, but Susan's practical nature sometimes clashed with Mary's unwavering focus on finding Lucas. 20 years had passed, yet the weight of loss hadn't diminished. The walk to the pharmacy took Mary through a quiet neighborhood she didn't know. Spokane felt different from Boise. More trees, steeper hills, unfamiliar rhythms. She appreciated the anonymity here. No one gave her the pitying looks she'd grown accustomed to back home. After collecting Susan's medication, Mary took a different route back, needing more time alone with her thoughts. She passed a small white church nestled between maple trees, its modest steeple reaching toward clouds that had begun gathering overhead. Something made her slow her pace. Perhaps the cheerful yellow tulips lining the walkway or the rainbow-colored banners announcing a youth event. Her eyes drifted to a community bulletin board beside the entrance. Amid notices for bake sales and prayer groups, a colorful flyer stood out. "Meet our youth ministry team," read the heading in bold blue letters. 5 smiling faces looked back at her, but one stopped her heart mid-beat. A young man with dark hair and a gentle smile stood slightly apart from the others. "David Wilson, youth mentor," the caption read, but it wasn't his name that made Mary's shopping bag slip from her fingers. It was his eyes, one blue as a summer sky, one warm honey brown, heterochromia, just like Lucas. Mary stepped closer, trembling fingers touching the paper. The young man appeared to be in his mid-20s, the right age. His jawline had the same subtle curve she remembered from Robert's side of the family, the shape of his eyes, the way his smile lifted slightly higher on the left. "Can I help you?" A voice startled her from behind. Mary pulled her hand back as if burned. "No, I'm just looking," she managed, retrieving her fallen bag without taking her eyes off the flyer. She memorized the service times listed at the bottom before continuing her walk, each step heavier than the last. 20 years of searching, of hoping against hope, and now, on an ordinary April morning in a city she barely knew, Mary Johnson faced the possibility that her son might have been here all along. Mary's knees nearly gave way beneath her as she stared at the church flyer. The world around her seemed to fade, the bustling Spokane street dissolving into background noise. Those eyes, one blue, one honey brown, had haunted her dreams for 20 years. She'd spent countless nights scrolling through missing children databases, searching for that distinctive gaze that belonged only to her son. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice catching on the name she'd repeated like a prayer every night since that terrible day at the Boise Fairgrounds. Her trembling fingers reached out, tracing the outline of the young man's face on the paper. The features had matured, of course, the round cheeks of her 5-year-old boy, now replaced by the defined jawline of a young adult. But those eyes remained unchanged, windows to a soul she'd never stopped searching for. Mary pressed a shaking hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the flyer, as if afraid the image might vanish if she looked elsewhere. The caption beneath the photo, "Meet David, our youth mentor," seemed both foreign and familiar. David, not Lucas, a new name for a life she knew nothing about. Memories flooded back, the carousel music, the red cap, those Spider-Man sneakers blurring as he spun around laughing, the stuffed elephant, Nino, waiting on his bed for a return that never came, the countless birthdays marked only by a solitary candle and whispered wishes. "Mary, Mary, what's wrong?" Susan's voice broke through her trance. Her sister had come looking for her, concern etched across her face. Mary hadn't realized how long she'd been standing there, frozen to the spot, clutching the church announcement in her white-knuckled grip. "It's him," Mary whispered, her voice barely more than air. She thrust the flyer toward Susan, whose eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Look at his eyes, Sue. The heterochromia. It's exactly like Lucas's. Susan gripped Mary's arm to steady her. Are you sure? After all this time? I'd know those eyes anywhere. Mary's voice grew stronger with conviction. A mother knows. Doubt and hope waged war within her, the rational part of her mind cautioning against another heartbreak, while her maternal instinct screamed with certainty. She'd followed countless leads over the years, each one ending in disappointment. Robert had eventually given up, moving across Idaho to escape the endless cycle of hope and despair. But Mary had never stopped believing. We need to be careful, Susan cautioned, always the practical one. But I'm with you, whatever you decide to do next. Mary nodded, but the certainty in her gut was unshakable. After 20 years of searching, of keeping Lucas's room exactly as he'd left it, of returning to those fairgrounds every anniversary, she had found him. Her son was alive. Mary Johnson arrived at the White Church 20 minutes early, her heart racing as she slipped into the back pew. The choir rehearsal wouldn't start for a while, but she couldn't risk missing him. Her trembling fingers traced the church program as she waited. The printed name, David, jumping off the page each time she glanced at it. The sanctuary gradually filled with children's voices, their energy bouncing off the stained glass windows. Mary sat perfectly still, barely breathing, as if any movement might shatter this fragile moment. When David finally entered from a side door, she nearly gasped aloud. In person, the resemblance was even more striking. Those unmistakable heterochromatic eyes, one blue and one honey brown, exactly as she remembered from when Lucas was just a baby. "Let's gather in a circle, everyone," David called out, his voice warm and patient. The children responded immediately, gravitating toward him with obvious affection. Mary watched as he knelt beside a small girl struggling with sheet music, helping her find the right page with gentle hands. His smile, Robert's smile, made Mary's chest tighten painfully. For nearly an hour, she observed him working with the choir. He moved with confidence among the children, occasionally demonstrating a high note or clapping out a rhythm. His laughter echoed through the sanctuary when a young boy made a joke, the sound so achingly familiar that Mary had to grip the pew to steady herself. Then it happened. As David glanced around the room, his gaze swept past the back pews and locked with Mary's. For one breathless moment, time seemed to stop. Something flickered across his features, a shadow of recognition, a whisper of memory. His brow furrowed slightly, hands pausing mid-gesture, as if trying to place her face in some distant recollection. Just as quickly, the moment passed. David looked away, confusion clouding his expression as he returned his attention to the choir. But Mary had seen it, that brief spark of connection that confirmed what her heart already knew. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the scene before her. She blinked them back fiercely, refusing to give in to emotion. Not now. Not when she was so close. The detective in Boise had always told her to trust her instincts, and every fiber of her being was screaming that this young man was her Lucas. As the rehearsal concluded, Mary remained seated, watching David chat with parents and children. She would approach him soon, but first, she needed to compose herself. 20 years of searching had led to this church, this moment. She couldn't falter now when the truth was finally within reach. The choir's final notes echoed through the church as Mary gathered her courage. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the grey-haired man who had been directing the children. With trembling hands, she introduced herself, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Pastor Martin, I was wondering if I could ask you about David, your youth mentor." The pastor's kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Of course. David's been a blessing to our congregation. The children adore him." Mary swallowed hard. "So, how long has he been with your church?" Pastor Martin led her to a small office, adjacent to the sanctuary, gesturing for her to take a seat. The walls were lined with photographs of church events and youth activities. In several, she could see David, Lucas, smiling, surrounded by children. "David came to us about 10 years ago," Pastor Martin explained, settling into his chair. He was just 15 then, a troubled boy with no memory of his past. Said he'd been in an accident. Mary's breath caught. No memory at all. None he was willing to share, the pastor said. He was terrified, disoriented, had nothing but a worn backpack and a single photograph. The pastor opened his desk drawer and carefully removed a plastic sleeve. Inside was a faded photograph, its corners bent and worn from handling. This was all he had to connect him to his past. I've kept it safe all these years. Mary's hands shook as she accepted the sleeve. The moment she saw the image, the world seemed to tilt beneath her. A small boy sat atop a carousel horse, his face split with joy, a red cap perched on his head. It was the exact photo Robert had taken moments before Lucas vanished, the last picture they had of their son. "This is," she whispered, unable to finish the sentence. "I always thought it might be David as a child," Pastor Martin said gently. Though he never confirmed it. Mary pressed her fingers against the plastic, tracing the outline of the boy's face. "Where did he stay before coming here?" He mentioned a woman he called Mama Ruth, who had cared for him, but she disappeared one night, left him alone. The pastor's voice softened. "We took him in, helped him build a life. He's never shown interest in finding his past." Mary nodded, tears threatening to spill. The evidence before her was overwhelming, the heterochromatic eyes, the photograph, the age. Yet the distance between the 5-year-old boy she'd lost and this young man seemed impossibly vast. "Would you like to meet him properly?" Pastor Martin asked, noticing her distress. "Perhaps tomorrow after service?" Mary clutched the photograph, nodding. 20 years of searching. And now only hours separated her from answers she'd prayed for every night since that summer day in Boise. The Sunday morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the small Spokane church as Mary Johnson sat in the back pew, her hands trembling around her purse. She had barely slept the night before, rehearsing what she would say to the young man who might be her long-lost son. Susan had offered to come with her, but Mary knew this moment needed to be faced alone. After the service ended, David lingered near the altar, chatting with some of the youth choir members. His gentle demeanor with the children made Mary's heart ache with both pride and sorrow for all the years she'd missed. Pastor Martin caught her eye and gave an encouraging nod before discreetly guiding the congregation toward the fellowship hall, leaving the sanctuary quiet. "David," the pastor called softly. "There's someone who'd like to speak with you." The young man approached cautiously, his mismatched eyes, one blue, one honey brown, studying Mary with polite curiosity. Up close, she could see the shadow of Robert in his jawline, the echo of her own father in his posture. "Hello," he said, extending his hand. "Pastor Martin mentioned you wanted to talk?" Mary nodded, unable to find her voice at first. "Thank you for meeting me," she finally managed. "I'm Mary." They sat in a pew near the front, an awkward silence stretching between them. With shaking fingers, Mary unzipped her purse and withdrew the worn stuffed elephant that had remained on Lucas's bed for 20 years. "I believe this might mean something to you," she whispered, holding Nino out. David's reaction was immediate. He flinched backward as if the toy might burn him. His eyes widened, pupils dilating with something between recognition and fear. Don't," he began, but his hand moved of its own accord, reaching toward the faded grey plush. When his fingers brushed the worn fabric of the elephant's ear, David went completely still. Mary watched as his expression transformed, confusion giving way to something deeper, more primal. I know this," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. His fingers traced the stitching where she had repaired the trunk countless times. "Nino." The name came unbidden to his lips. Surprising them both, memories flickered behind his eyes, a carousel spinning in dizzying circles, yellow balloons against a blue summer sky, a woman's desperate cries echoing through a crowded fairground, the sticky, sweet taste of cotton candy dissolving on his tongue. "You used to sleep with him tucked under your chin," Mary said softly. "You wouldn't go anywhere without him." David's hands trembled as he cradled the stuffed elephant, tears welling in his eyes. How do I know this? Why does it feel like—" Mary's tears flowed freely now, her heart simultaneously soaring and breaking. "Because he was yours, Lucas. He's always been waiting for you to come home." David sat across from Mary in the church's small meeting room, his fingers nervously tapping against his knee. "The dreams started when I was about 15, he confessed, his heterochromatic eyes, one blue, one honey brown, avoiding her gaze. "They're always the same. A carousel spinning too fast, yellow balloons floating away, and this overwhelming feeling of being lost." Mary Johnson leaned forward, her heart racing. These weren't random dreams, they were memories trying to surface. The carousel, the yellow balloons sold at the fair that day, details she'd never mentioned to him. "What else do you remember?" she asked gently, fighting to keep her voice steady. The young man shrugged, running a hand through his hair. Sometimes there's music, carnival music, and a woman calling a name I can't quite hear." He paused, his expression troubled. "Pastor Martin says trauma can fragment memories, lock them away." Mary nodded, tears threatening. Each fragment he described matched perfectly with the day Lucas disappeared. She reached across the table but stopped short of touching his hand, afraid of pushing too hard. "I need to understand," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Would you mind if I looked around the church? Maybe there's something that could help us make sense of this." David hesitated before nodding. "Pastor Martin keeps old records in the storage room, second door past the choir practice area." The storage room was dimly lit and cluttered with decades of church history. Mary searched methodically, opening boxes labeled with years that aligned with when David first appeared at the church. In the third box, beneath faded bulletins and donation records, she found it, a small, dusty shoebox. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a crumpled piece of lined paper, the edges worn soft with age. The handwriting was childish, uneven, exactly how she remembered 5-year-old Lucas forming his letters during their kitchen table practice sessions. "My name is Lucas Johnson. Please help me find my mom." Mary pressed the note to her chest, a sob escaping her lips. Below it was a crude drawing of a woman with long hair standing beside a carousel. Her son had been here all along, trying to find his way back to her. When she returned to David, note in hand, she found him staring out the window, lost in thought. "David," she said softly, "I found something you wrote a long time ago." He turned, confusion crossing his features as she placed the paper in his hands. His eyes widened as he read the childish scrawl. Recognition flickering across his face. "I wrote this," he whispered, "not a question but a statement. I remember writing this." His voice broke as he looked up at Mary, truly seeing her for the first time. "You're her, aren't you? The mom I was trying to find." The truth hung between them, undeniable and overwhelming. The revelation that David might be Lucas sent shockwaves through the Johnson family. Susan called Mary every few hours from her recovery bed in Spokane, her voice breaking with joy and disbelief. "I always knew," she kept saying through tears, "I always knew he was out there somewhere." But when Mary finally reached Robert by phone at his apartment across Idaho, his reaction was unexpected. Silence hung heavy on the line before he whispered, "I need to tell you something." 3 days later, a package arrived at Mary's doorstep. Inside lay a stack of yellowed envelopes bound with twine, anonymous letters Robert had received over the years. Each contained fragments of information: a boy with mismatched eyes spotted at a gas station in Oregon, a teenager with no past working at a summer camp in Washington, a child's drawing signed L found in a motel outside Spokane. Mary's hands trembled as she spread them across her kitchen table. 20 years, she whispered, anger and grief colliding inside her. You had these for 20 years and never told me." When Robert arrived that evening, the weight of decades seemed to press down on his shoulders. The man who had once stood tall beside her at the fairgrounds now appeared diminished, hollowed out by regret. "I couldn't bear to see you broken again," he explained, unable to meet her eyes. "Every false lead, every disappointment, they were killing you, Mary, and they were killing us." Mary slammed her palm against the table. Ah, that wasn't your choice to make. These were clues, real clues that might have led us to him years ago. Robert finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. I hired private investigators for each one. They all led nowhere, or so I thought. He ran his fingers through his graying hair. I was trying to protect what little we had left. We had nothing left, Mary said, her voice softening despite herself. Nothing but hope. Robert reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. I never stopped loving him, he confessed, tears finally breaking free. Or you. But I was terrified of another heartbreak. After the 3rd year, the detective told me to prepare for the worst. I couldn't accept it, but I couldn't live in permanent suspension either. Mary studied the man she had once built a life with, seeing both the husband she'd lost and the broken father before her. The betrayal stung sharply, yet beneath it lay an understanding she hadn't expected to find. "We need to focus on Lucas now," she finally said, gathering the letters. "He needs both of us to help him remember." Robert nodded, relief and determination replacing the guilt in his eyes. "I want to meet my son." Pastor Martin sat across from Mary in his modest office, his weathered hands folded on the desk between them. The afternoon light filtered through dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. "There's something you should know about David," Pastor Martin began, his voice gentle but serious. "When he first arrived at our church, he wasn't alone. An older woman brought him. She called herself Mama Ruth." Mary Johnson leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Who was she?" "She claimed to have rescued David from an abusive home," the pastor explained. "Said God had guided her to save special children who needed protection. She was intense, but seemed genuinely concerned for him." According to Pastor Martin, Mama Ruth had appeared one rainy evening with 15-year-old David in tow. The boy was quiet, withdrawn, clutching only a battered backpack and the carousel photograph. For several months, they lived in a small apartment the church provided for those in need. Then one morning, David woke up and she was gone. Pastor Martin continued. No note, no explanation, just vanished, leaving the boy behind with his few possessions. He was devastated. She was the only family he knew. Mary's hands trembled as she processed this information. "Did you report her disappearance to the police?" "We did, but there wasn't much to go on. She'd given us no last name, no background. The authorities checked, but—" He shrugged helplessly. Something in his expression made Mary suspicious. "There's more, isn't there?" The pastor hesitated before opening a drawer. He pulled out a faded photograph, sliding it across the desk. "This was taken at our summer youth retreat about 9 years ago." Mary studied the image, a group of teenagers standing by a lake. Her eyes immediately found David, younger but unmistakable with his distinctive eyes. Then she noticed another boy standing beside him, no more than 12 years old, with the exact same heterochromatic eyes, one blue, one honey brown. "His name was Michael," Pastor Martin said quietly. "He stayed with us for 2 weeks before Mama Ruth came and took him away. Said they had to move on. We never saw him again." Mary's blood ran cold. Another boy with the same eyes. From what I could piece together, he disappeared from Portland 3 years before David came to us. Mary stared at the photograph, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Lucas anymore. The pattern was unmistakable and utterly chilling. Mama Ruth hadn't just taken her son. She'd been collecting children with this rare trait, like precious specimens. "We need to find her," Mary whispered, her fingers tracing the faces in the photograph. "And we need to find Michael too." Mary's relentless pursuit of answers caught the attention of Rachel Evans, the detective who had led the original investigation in Boise. Though recently retired after 30 years on the force, Rachel had never truly let go of the Johnson case. It haunted her dreams, the image of Mary clutching that stuffed elephant, the search teams combing through endless fields, and the crushing weight of having to tell a mother they had no leads. "I've thought about your boy every day for 20 years, Rachel confessed when Mary called her. The detective's voice cracked slightly, betraying the professional facade she'd maintained throughout her career. "If there's even a chance this is Lucas, I need to be there." Within 48 hours, Rachel arrived in Spokane with a weathered case file and the determined look of someone seeking redemption. She and Mary set up an impromptu investigation center in Susan's dining room, pinning maps and timelines to corkboards, while Susan kept them supplied with coffee and sandwiches. "Tell me everything about this Mama Ruth," Rachel insisted, her experienced eyes scanning the church flyer featuring David. And every detail matters. They meticulously retraced David's arrival at the church, interviewing Pastor Martin again and examining the few possessions he'd brought with him. The breakthrough came when they discovered a faded address book among David's belongings, containing cryptic notations about various towns and dates. Rachel's methodical approach unearthed a startling connection. While cross-referencing old records, they discovered that a woman matching Mama Ruth's description had once lived as a boarder in Mary's father's house in Boise, nearly 3 years before Lucas disappeared. "She called herself Ruth Madsen then," Mary whispered, the color draining from her face as she recognized the name from her childhood. "She used to bring me candy when I visited my father. She even babysat me once or twice." The detective leaned forward, her expression grim. "This wasn't random, Mary. She studied your family, your routines. She might have been planning this for years." They found rental records showing Ruth had moved to an apartment overlooking the fairgrounds 6 months before Lucas vanished. The pieces fell into place with chilling clarity, a calculated abduction by someone who had methodically inserted herself into their lives. "She knew exactly when to strike," Rachel said, staring at the timeline they'd created. "She knew where you'd be, what Lucas looked like, even which rides he preferred." Mary clutched the stuffed elephant to her chest, a familiar gesture that spoke volumes about the pain she'd carried for 2 decades. "All this time," she said, "she was hiding in plain sight." The Boise Police Department officially reopened the investigation into Lucas Johnson's disappearance after 20 years of dead ends. Detective Rachel Evans, though retired, took point on the case, driven by the guilt that had haunted her for 2 decades. Her first move was to focus on Leonard Cook, a former fairground employee whose name had appeared in the original case files, but was never thoroughly investigated. His record shows 3 complaints of inappropriate behavior around children before the fair, Rachel explained to Mary, as they reviewed the yellowed files spread across the Johnson kitchen table. But nothing concrete enough for an arrest. Mary's hands trembled as she studied Leonard's mugshot. The man had worked at 4 different fairs across Idaho and Washington during the same period when other children had vanished. The pattern was unmistakable now that they knew what to look for. 3 witnesses from the original investigation were re-interviewed, and all recalled seeing a man matching Leonard's description near the carousel on that fateful day. One even remembered him speaking with an older woman whose description aligned perfectly with Mama Ruth: grey hair pulled into a tight bun, floral dress, and wire-rimmed glasses. "They seemed to know each other," said the witness, a former popcorn vendor. "Not friendly exactly, more like business partners." The breakthrough came when Eliza Winters, a longtime church member from Spokane, arrived at the police station clutching an old cassette tape. Her late husband had worked security at the Boise Fairgrounds that summer. "He always said something wasn't right about how they handled that missing boy," Eliza told Rachel, her voice quavering. "He kept this tape as insurance," he said. When they played the recording, Glenn Davis, the fair manager at the time, could be heard clearly dismissing concerns about Leonard Cook. "Keep this quiet. We can't afford another scandal. The fair's barely staying afloat as it is." Mary listened, white-knuckled, as the man continued. "That Johnson kid probably just wandered off. No need to drag Cook into this and spook the public." Robert, who had driven from across the state after hearing about the tape, placed a hesitant hand on Mary's shoulder. For the first time in years, she didn't pull away. "They knew," she whispered, voice breaking. "They knew, and they did nothing." Rachel gathered the evidence methodically. The cover-up stalled the original investigation, she explained. By the time we started looking at Leonard seriously, he had disappeared, likely with Mama Ruth's help. The search for Leonard Cook began in earnest, with police circulating his photo across state lines. Meanwhile, Mary and Robert sat together in silence, united by a shared anger that somehow felt healthier than the blame that had divided them for 20 years. The drive to Boise felt surreal to David. Each mile brought him closer to a past he couldn't fully remember, but somehow felt drawn to. Mary Johnson sat beside him in the car, occasionally glancing his way with eyes that held 20 years of longing. "We're almost there," she said softly, as they turned onto a quiet suburban street lined with maple trees. The Johnson home stood exactly as it had for 2 decades, a modest 2-story with faded blue trim and a porch swing that creaked in the gentle Idaho breeze. David's heart raced as he stepped from the vehicle. His fingers instinctively reached for Mary's hand, seeking an anchor in this sea of unfamiliar familiarity. "Take your time," she whispered, squeezing his fingers reassuringly. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and something else, something that tugged at the edges of his consciousness. Mary led him through the living room, where framed photographs chronicled a life interrupted. In many of them, a small boy with mismatched eyes smiled back at him. "Would you like to see your room?" Mary asked, her voice trembling slightly. David nodded, unable to form words as they climbed the stairs. The second door on the right stood closed, as if waiting. Mary paused, a hand on the doorknob, giving him a moment to prepare. The door swung open to reveal a time capsule, soft blue walls, exactly as in his fragmented dreams. A child-sized bed with a spaceship comforter, shelves lined with picture books and toy cars, and in the corner a bookcase, handcrafted with loving precision. "Your father built that," Mary explained, watching his reaction carefully. "Robert spent 3 weekends on it. You used to arrange your dinosaurs on the top shelf." David moved into the room as if in a trance. His fingers traced the edge of the bookshelf, and suddenly a flash, his smaller hands placing plastic dinosaurs in battle formation, while a man's voice praised his creativity. "Remember," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. He sank onto the bed, overwhelmed. The mattress gave way exactly as it had in dreams he'd never understood. The scent of Mary's perfume, vanilla and jasmine, triggered another cascade of memories. Bedtime stories, goodnight kisses, a woman's gentle laugh. Tears streamed down his face. Mary sat beside him, her own cheeks wet with silent emotion. Neither spoke. No words could bridge 20 years of separation. Instead, they sat together in the blue room, where time had stood still, their hands intertwined, the man he had become slowly reconnecting with the boy he once was. The abandoned motel on the outskirts of Spokane looked like something from a forgotten era. Detective Rachel Evans led Mary through the dilapidated hallway, their footsteps echoing against peeling wallpaper. The retired investigator had received an anonymous tip about room 17, the same number as Lucas's birthday. "We found this yesterday," Rachel said, pushing open the door to reveal a time capsule. The small room contained a metal desk, with a notebook open to a page where Lucas Johnson was written repeatedly in a child's handwriting. Pinned to the walls were dozens of drawings, crayon illustrations of carousels, fairgrounds, and a woman with grey hair labelled Mama. Mary's hand trembled as she touched one drawing, showing a stick figure with different coloured dots for eyes. "He remembered," she whispered, tracing the heterochromatic eyes that made her son so distinctive. Rachel pointed to a corner where investigators had collected hair samples, clothing fibres, and fingerprints. "We believe Mama Ruth kept him here during the first months after the abduction. The landlord confirmed a woman matching her description rented this room for 6 months before disappearing." Mary nodded, overwhelmed by the evidence that her son had been so close yet unreachable for all these years. The room felt like a shrine to stolen childhood, preserved exactly as it had been when Lucas occupied it. Back at Susan's home, Mary sat beside David, her Lucas, as they waited for the DNA results. The testing had been expedited, but each hour felt like an eternity. She found herself studying his face, searching for the 5-year-old boy in the features of the young man beside her. "What if I'm not him?" David asked one evening, voicing the fear that had been growing between them. Mary squeezed his hand. "The stuffed elephant, the carousel photo, your eyes, I know in my heart who you are." Susan brought them tea, her presence a calming influence during the agonizing wait. "The results will only confirm what we already know," she assured them both. As days passed, Mary refused to release David's hand during their conversations, as if afraid he might vanish again. "I let go once," she told him. "I won't make that mistake again." Robert called daily from Boise, his voice thick with emotion as he prepared their home for Lucas's return. The bedroom had remained untouched for 20 years, a shrine to absence now ready to welcome its rightful occupant. When Detective Evans finally arrived with the sealed envelope, Mary and David sat together on Susan's floral couch, fingers intertwined. The moment had arrived when science would either validate or destroy their fragile hope. Mary took a deep breath and reached for the future, with the same hand that had once lost the past. The results arrived in a plain manila envelope addressed to Detective Rachel Evans. Inside, the DNA test confirmed what Mary Johnson had known in her heart. Since seeing that church flyer, David was indeed her son Lucas. The detective personally delivered the news to Mary's doorstep in Boise, watching as 20 years of anguish dissolved into tearful relief. "Would be 100% match," Rachel said, her voice steady despite her own welling emotions. "It's official, Mary. You found him." The confirmation spread like wildfire through local media. The Boise Gazette ran a front-page headline, "Missing Boy Found After 2 Decades," accompanied by a side-by-side photo of 5-year-old Lucas and the man he had become. Television crews camped outside the Johnson home, their vans lining the quiet suburban street as reporters sought interviews with the family that had defied impossible odds. Mary's phone rang constantly with calls from well-wishers and old friends who had helped search for her son years ago. Even Robert, still struggling with his own guilt, found himself fielding questions from colleagues who remembered his heartbreak. "I never thought I'd hear people say his name again," he confessed to Susan during a rare moment of vulnerability. "But not like this, not with hope." The case rekindled interest in other unsolved disappearances. 3 families from neighboring states contacted Detective Evans after recognizing similarities to their own missing children cases. Each child had distinctive features, like Lucas's heterochromatic eyes, that Mama Ruth seemed to target. The police department formed a special task force focused on identifying other potential victims. They enlarged the group photograph from Pastor Martin's office, digitally enhancing the faces of children standing beside young Lucas. The image became a powerful symbol, displayed at press conferences and shared across social media platforms. "We believe Mama Ruth may have abducted at least 5 children over a 15-year period," Detective Evans explained during a community briefing. The photograph suggests Lucas wasn't isolated. He had siblings, other stolen children living together under her control. For Lucas, the confirmation brought both peace and turmoil. His identity was no longer divided between David and Lucas. He was whole again. Yet reconciling his memories of the church mentor with the abducted child proved challenging. "I remember fragments now," he told Mary one evening as they sorted through childhood photographs. "Not everything, but enough to know I belong here." The group photo became his personal mission. Each night, he studied the faces of the children who had shared his captivity, determined to help them find their way home, just as he had. "They're still out there," he whispered, tracing the outline of a small girl with braided hair. "And they deserve what I have now, the truth." Lucas sat in the living room of Mary's Boise home, his hands trembling as he flipped through old photo albums. The images showed a smiling child with mismatched eyes, one blue, One Honey Brown, playing in a backyard he couldn't remember. I keep trying to make sense of it all, he confessed, voice barely above a whisper. Mama Ruth would read me bedtime stories one night, then lock me in my room the next if I asked about my real family. Mary Johnson reached across the coffee table and squeezed her son's hand. The touch still felt new, tentative, but increasingly familiar. 20 years of separation couldn't erase the instinctive connection between them. I have something to show you, she said, retrieving a worn, leather-bound book from her bag. Pastor Martin found this in a donation box at the church last week. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Lucas's breath caught as he recognized the familiar cursive, her diary. The pages revealed a disturbed mind, entries dating back decades, long before Lucas's abduction. Mama Ruth had meticulously documented children with special gifts, unusual eye colors, birthmarks, twins, believing these children needed protection from a corrupt world. She thought she was saving us, Lucas murmured, tracing his finger over a page where his own name appeared. There were nights when she seemed so normal. We'd bake cookies together, or she'd help me with homework. Mary fought back tears as she read passages describing how Ruth had watched their family for months before the fair, convinced that Lucas's heterochromatic eyes marked him as chosen. She was at my father's boarding house years before you were born, Mary explained. She studied our routines, our habits. The fair wasn't random, it was planned. Lucas closed the diary, unable to read more. I feel sorry for her, he admitted, surprising himself. She was deeply sick, but in her twisted way, she thought she was doing something good. Mary nodded slowly. Understanding doesn't mean forgiving what she took from us. 20 birthdays, your first day of high school, all those moments we can never get back. Tears streamed down Lucas's face as the weight of lost time crashed over him. Mary moved to sit beside him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. We can't change the past, she whispered, her voice steady despite her own tears. But we have tomorrow, and all the days after that. Outside, rain began to fall, washing the windows clean. Lucas leaned into his mother's embrace, feeling both like the 5-year-old boy who'd been stolen and the 25-year-old man who'd found his way home. Together, he agreed, the word both a promise and a healing. Robert Johnson pulled up to the driveway of the Boise home he once shared with his family, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, the weight of 20 years pressed on his shoulders as he approached the front door, rehearsing apologies that seemed woefully inadequate. When Mary opened the door, the silence between them spoke volumes before either uttered a word. He's waiting in the kitchen, she said softly. The breakfast table, still the same oak piece they had purchased when first married, now hosted their extraordinary reunion. Lucas sat with perfect posture, a habit he'd developed at the church. His heterochromatic eyes, one blue, one honey brown, studied his father's face, searching for connections to his fragmented memories. I brought something, Robert said, placing a small wooden box on the table. Inside was a collection of baseball cards they had once collected together. I kept adding to it every year. Lucas ran his fingers over the cards, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. I remember sorting these by team colors instead of value. You always said it drove you crazy. They shared a tentative laugh, the first bridge across their vast divide. Mary prepared pancakes, Lucas's childhood favorite, and watched as father and son cautiously rebuilt their relationship. The conversation stumbled at times, pausing when emotions threatened to overwhelm, but never completely halting. Robert's eyes glistened with tears when Lucas called him Dad for the first time, the word falling from his lips as naturally as if he'd never stopped saying it. That Sunday, Susan arrived with armfuls of food for the brunch she had organized. Always the peacemaker, she transformed the tense atmosphere with her warmth and practical approach to healing. No use dwelling on what we can't change, she reminded them, setting out platters of food in the sunlit dining room. Friends from the church joined them, bringing casseroles and desserts. Pastor Martin arrived with a photo album documenting Lucas's years in Spokane, a gift that brought both joy and sorrow to Mary and Robert as they glimpsed the milestones they had missed. "Pastor Martin taught me how to drive," Lucas recalled, laughing as he described knocking over a mailbox during his first lesson. "He never lost his patience, even when I nearly drove us into the church sign." As the afternoon progressed, the conversation flowed more easily. Lucas shared stories of the choir performances, summer camps, and the friends who had become his surrogate family. Through his words, his parents glimpsed the good that had existed alongside the tragedy, the kindness that had shaped their son into the man before them. "I had two families," Lucas said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "And now, somehow, I have both." Detective Rachel Evans stood at the podium, her posture straight and confident as camera flashes illuminated her face. After 20 years, the veteran investigator finally had answers about Lucas Johnson's disappearance. The press conference room buzzed with energy as she announced the reopening of the case and the investigation into Mama Ruth's other possible victims. "This case reminds us never to give up hope," Rachel declared, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "The Johnson family's perseverance has not only brought their son home, but may help other families find closure." The Boise community, once divided by whispers and suspicions about the disappearance, united around the Johnson family. Local businesses displayed posters of the group photo from Pastor Martin's office, hoping someone might recognize the other children. The fairgrounds hosted a candlelight vigil where hundreds gathered, holding flames against the darkness that had once swallowed a little boy's future. Mary Johnson found herself surrounded by neighbors who had previously avoided her gaze, unsure how to approach her grief. Now they embraced her, sharing tears and congratulations. The weight of 2 decades of isolation began to lift from her shoulders. "I never thought I'd feel part of this town again," Mary confided to Susan as they watched volunteers setting up for a fundraiser benefiting the National Center for Missing Children. Her sister squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had traveled. As Lucas adjusted to his rediscovered identity, his bond with Mary grew stronger each day. They spent evenings looking through photo albums, his memory returning in fragments, a birthday cake here, a Christmas morning there. During one such evening, Lucas looked up from a family vacation photo. "I want to go back," he said quietly, "to the fairgrounds." The next day, mother and son stood at the entrance to the Boise Summer Fair, the same archway where a family of 3 had once passed through, whole and happy. Mary trembled slightly, but Lucas took her hand. "We don't have to do this," she whispered. "Yes, we do," he replied, his mismatched eyes, one blue, Udhani brown, reflecting determination. They walked slowly through the grounds, past cotton candy vendors and game booths. Children laughed and ran, parents called after them, and the world continued its ordinary magic all around them. When they reached the carousel, Lucas stopped, his gaze fixed on the painted horses rising and falling in their endless circle. Mary held her breath, watching her son's face as he confronted the epicenter of their tragedy. After a moment, Lucas turned to her with a sad smile. "I remember the music," he said simply. The carousel's music drifted through the evening air as Mary Johnson stood hand in hand with Lucas, gazing at the spinning lights. 20 years of anguish had carved lines around her eyes, but tonight they reflected only wonder. The fairgrounds, once a place of unspeakable loss, now hummed with possibility. "I used to dream about this place," Lucas said softly. "I never understood why carousels made me feel both terrified and safe." He squeezed his mother's hand, the connection between them still fragile but strengthening with each passing day. Mary nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She remembered countless nights spent wandering these grounds, searching for ghosts and answers. Now, standing beside her son, a grown man with gentle eyes and a youth mentor's patience, the pain hadn't vanished, but had transformed into something bearable. "Pastor Martin says healing isn't about forgetting," Lucas continued, watching the painted horses rise and fall. It's about remembering without being consumed by it. In the distance, Robert approached cautiously, carrying 3 ice cream cones. The estranged husband had been staying in Boise for 2 weeks now, renting a small apartment downtown. His tentative smiles and earnest efforts spoke of a man desperate for redemption. "I got your favorite," he said, handing Lucas a chocolate cone. "At least, what used to be your favorite." Lucas accepted it with a smile. Some things don't change. Susan joined them moments later, camera in hand. The whole family on a carousel. This needs documenting. The music swelled as they chose their mounts, Mary and Lucas selecting 2 horses side by side, while Robert and Susan took positions behind them. The platform began to turn, and Mary felt a flutter of panic, an echo of that terrible day. But Lucas reached across the gap between their horses and took her hand. "We're okay now," he said. Detective Evans watched from a bench nearby, satisfaction evident in her posture. The retired investigator had finally closed her most haunting case. She waved as the carousel carried them past. As they spun beneath the twinkling lights, Mary thought about the others, children from the group photograph, still missing. Tomorrow, they would continue working with authorities to find them. The notebook and drawings from the motel had already provided valuable clues. But tonight was for reclaiming joy. The carousel completed another revolution, and Mary found herself laughing, a sound so foreign it startled her. Around and around they went, no longer trapped in the cycle of loss and longing, but moving forward together. When the ride finally slowed, Lucas stepped down first, offering his hand to his mother. They walked away from the carousel not as victims of a tragedy that had defined them for 2 decades, but as a family reborn, scarred but whole, their story still unfolding with each step forward.